Welcome back to your nightmares, my children. This is Mr. Midnight speaking. I welcome you all to my humble abode. Today, we will look at yet again 3 scary Skinwalker stories that will terrify you and make you think twice before touching, talking, petting a dog, cat, or whatever, to be honest. I hope you enjoy this. And I want you to always remember the darkness always follows. I will now leave you with my narrator, so enjoy.
Never shoot a skinwalker. My two buddies and I went on a hunting trip for bull elk last November, and we were having a great time to say the least. That, however, would change after what we saw on the third day. Now, I'm not one for superstition and I don't believe in ghosts at all. But what we saw out there really changed my view about those sort of things. The trip started out normally after we parked our trailers at camp. We got there a day early before the hunt officially started, so we could settle in and get some scouting done. Only Eric and I had licenses because Brian didn't draw out this year, but he wanted to come along with us anyway. Brian also brought along his German Shepherd named Lucy. We'd stayed back at camp with a leash that was connected to a metal spike. The spike was so deep in the ground that I wondered if we would be able to get it out. I asked Brian, and he just told me that his dog was so strong that it had to be that deep. I enjoyed playing with Lucy. She was always excited to see me and would greet me by jumping up on 2 legs and trying to lick my face. Eric, however, was not amused by her and would constantly yell at her to leave him alone. Anyway, the first 2 days we saw so many cow elk in valleys and on sides of the mountains that I thought for sure we would see some bulls out there, but there were none among them. It wasn't until the third day of the hunt that we saw a bull elk, but it was too far away to take a shot at, and even if we were able to hit it, it would take hours trying to pack that thing out. So that evening we decided to hunker down next to some fallen trees and were able to watch a hillside. While we were serving the area, Brian spotted a coyote about 250 yards, walking to a small pond of water, strangely as if it was maimed. Eric took out his binoculars to take a closer look, and he started to describe it, saying, "That coyote, it ain't right looking. It has a hunch on its back like a bear. And its jaw, oh man, its damn jaw seems like it's been broken, and now it's just dropping there like a dead fish." "Let me see these binocs," I asked, curiously, with an outstretched hand. Eric handed them to me, and as he did, he seemed to grasp his gun tightly. I took them and looked at the animal and said, "You're right, that thing's jaw is just hanging there. Also, did you happen to notice its hair? It's so long and unevenly dispersed." I then handed the binoculars to Brian, and he looked at the coyote for 1 second and screamed. "Shh! Brian, shut up! We're hunting!" Eric whispered harshly. "What did you see?" I asked as I looked at his shocked facial expression. Brian looked at his feet and he muttered, I I saw my dog Lucy, but it wasn't her. I don't know what that was." "It could have been your dog. When I looked at it, it looked like a dying coyote. It didn't have the large black spot on its back, or your dog's strawberry red sides and underbelly," I said in a plain yet confused manner. "Well, since we ain't gonna see anything out here, 'cause you screamed like a baby, I'm going to put that coyote out of his misery. Egg said angrily as he raised his rifle and looked through the scope. A large shot followed, and we saw the animal drop down soon after. It was a clean kill, and Eric was curious about seeing what was wrong with the animal up close, so he started getting ready to hike out. As he got his stuff together, he said, "You probably just didn't get a good look at it, Brian. Your dog is fine." Brian stood up as he brushed the dirt off his butt. He replied, "I swear I saw my dog, but an evil, demented version of it with human eyes. But you guys are probably right. There's no way she could have had the strength to yank out the metal stake holding her back at camp." "Well, let's go find out the truth about this animal," I said, somewhat excitedly, as I started walking toward the dead animal. It took us about half an hour to hike over to it, and we lost sight of the animal's corpse as we had to pass through some trees. Once we finally got to the spot where the animal had dropped, there was no corpse, just a pool of blood. However, the blood was blackish and very dense. Eric observed the scene and started to scratch his head as he said, "I could have sworn I shot that thing straight through its heart. There's no way it could have just gotten back up and walked off." I had an eerie feeling about the whole situation, and Brian was still afraid that it might have been his dog that got shot. Eric, however, noticed a trail of blood leading into a dark tree line. Without asking, he started to follow it, and he loaded his gun. As he did, me and Brian were both freaked out and just watched Eric as he went into the forest. He soon went out of sight, and Brian and I could not leave him. So we waited for him. I passed the time by taking a skinny stick and poking at the puddle of blood. It smelled terrible, and the aroma hit me pretty hard, so much that my stomach convulsed and I threw up. "You okay?" Brian asked as he put his hand on my back. Before I could answer, there was a loud shot that echoed through the trees, and we both looked at the direction it came from. "We must have found the animal," I said as I split into the grass. As soon as I said that, we could now see Eric, but he was full on sprinting. "Run!" he screamed as he ran at us. I noticed that must have dropped his gun because he wasn't carrying it. I was about to ask him what happened, but Brian grabbed my arm and yanked me towards where he had parked the truck. Without hesitation, I ran. We soon made it back to the truck, and my shoulder hurt from the rubbing of the gun strap. I looked back at Eric, who slowed down for nothing. I soon looked behind him and saw nothing chasing us, so I opened the truck and got in without worry. Eric then climbed in and told me to hit the gas and go. I was so perplexed on what Eric saw out there, and I knew that he hardly ever got scared of anything, so this started to freak me out. I started driving fast back to the camp, and I asked Eric, "What did you see out there that was scary enough to make you drop your gun?" "I don't know, man. That was no damn animal. I followed the trail of blood and I stopped at the base of a tree, and I was wondering how a coyote was able to climb a tree. But when I looked up, I saw this hairy humanoid creature there. It smelled so freaking bad." Eric went on about how scary that thing was and how he was done with the hunting trip and wanted to go home. We soon pulled into camp and mutually decided that we were going home. I started to pack my things and then felt like something was missing. I then thought to myself, "Lucy, where is Brian's dog? She usually always is so excited to see us back at camp. She can't stop barking and whining to be set free." As soon as I thought this, Brian started screaming and crying. I ran over to where he was and saw that his dog was gone. However, on further inspection, I noticed what Brian was looking at. Something had pulled out the metal stake in the ground and strung Lucy up on a nearby tree and had skinned her. Brian just could not stop crying, and Eric ran over to see what was wrong and just stood there, jaw dropped and frozen. He then muttered, "She was skinned alive." There's a bunch of bruising caused by struggling around her neck where the collar is. Shut up, Eric, you ain't helping, I said as I put my shoulder around Brian, who had unstrung his dog's body from the tree. Skinwalker, Eric said in a low tone of voice, as he looked into the distance. He then screamed, "It's a damn Skinwalker!" I followed his gaze and saw an animal that looked like Lucy, but it had human eyes and a sickly green glazed looking coat of fur. Brian stopped crying and just stood there, eyes locked on the beast. Eric then whispered with his voice quivering, "We all run to the truck on a count of 3. Just leave everything else." Brian and I slowly nodded and agreed to the plan. "Okay, 3, 2, 1. Eric whispered more sharply, and we all took off like a pack of gazelles for the truck. We hopped in, and soon as we did, we saw the Skinwalker lunge at us and struck the right side door with such a powerful blow that nearly tipped over the whole truck. It didn't stop me whatsoever, and I drove out of there faster than I ever could have. After that, none of us ever went hunting again in that area. We never even went back to claim our camping trailers and supplies. It was too terrifying to think that what happened to Brian's dog could happen to us and that thing would walk around in our skin. Since that experience, I am now a superstitious person. Skinwalker stories from the past. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong, it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes. I rubbed over the gun and placed the ash-covered bullet inside the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling at had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name and it will finally kill them. It's been over 10 years. I never shared this story or understood what I saw until now. Hi everybody. I just told this story for the first time ever to some family at my aunt and uncle's cabin up north. We all live in Wisconsin, but their cabin is in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The whole family comes up a few times every summer to spend a weekend or week together. At the campfire last night, we went from sharing hunting stories, though I've never been a big hunter myself, to weirder ones. Not scary stories, really, just things we've experienced or heard that we don't have explanations for. I've been convinced by one of my cousins to post my only campfire story last night to no sleep here. This takes place about 10 to 12 years ago when my family took a road trip out west, as we say. I was probably 7 or 8. Anyway, I remember this happened just before we turned around and started coming back home. We've been through Mount Rushmore, Yellowstone, and I can't remember its name for the life of me. But we went to some sort of dinosaur sculpture park in Utah too. In Utah, we met up with some of my parents' old colleague friends who live there now. The Whites, their names and all names, have been changed for privacy, and drove out to a small town to stay a night or two with them. The place reminded me a bit of my grandparents' house. The nearest neighbors were within sight, maybe half a mile away. Not exactly isolated, but spacious. So after a few hours of driving from the dinosaur park, the Whites grilled us dinner outside, and in true Wisconsin fashion, had some beers with my parents on the porch after. My sister, 14 to 15 years old, and I were playing in the backyard too, with the White's autistic son, Kyle, who is between me and my sister's age, but I haven't seen him since, so I'm not 100% sure on his age. Well, we come across this really bad smell, like burning, singed arm hair. If you know what that's like. And suddenly, Kyle starts acting strange. He couldn't really speak clearly anyway, but he kept freezing and looking around frantically. He was shaking his head and making lots of noises. Eventually, the kid started breaking down and crying, like he was overwhelmed or we bullied him or something. I'm 8. I don't know what to do. I ask my sister. She takes off to tell the Whites and tells me to stay with Kyle. I get kind of nervous and start telling Kyle we should go back to the house. I heard my dad talking and laughing nearby, but couldn't see where he was. "Dad!" I yelled out. A few seconds later, both our parents come running over with my sister. Mr. White's got a shotgun, and I'm immediately terrified. What was going on? My mum and Mrs. White start calling our names. "Dan, come on over." And, "Kyle, it's okay, sweetie, come here." Mr. White barked, "Get over here now," like he was pissed as all hell. We both bolt, and Mr. White immediately starts firing into the shrubs behind us. I turned around and saw what Kyle was crying at, and what Mr. White was repelling. A huge, gangly coyote was taking off. I'd heard coyotes back in Wisconsin, but never saw one. From what the parents were saying, I gathered that this thing was pretty big and dangerous. Mr. White said it must be rabid or starving, because they usually don't come so close to the house. The Whites didn't have any farm animals or anything, nothing to attract any predators. Apparently, Mr. White had seen it a few days prior and warned Kyle, which made him freak when he actually saw it up close. The parents suggested we all come back inside before sundown, and I was glad to. I think I started crying after that close call. My dad and Mr. White did a sweep of the house as my mum and sister tried to comfort me. That night I was starting to feel better after a movie. I was showing Kyle my dinosaur toy collection in the living room when there was a sound at the door to the back porch. For context, the house was L-shaped. We were in the long part of the L, while my parents and sister were in the sunroom, which was around the corner in the flat part. We both stop and get a bit creeped out. But eventually, I go back to showing off my toys. The sound happens again. It's like a really weak knock without a rhythm. I hear Mrs. White talking through the door, but she sounds plastered. I didn't know what being drunk felt like back then, but I'd already been to enough family reunions to know that it made adults act and speak weird. Mrs. White sounded like she could barely string a sentence together, so I yelled a nervous, "Hey Mum," down the hall. Not a second later, I hear a scream come from the sunroom. Kyle starts crying, so I freak out and sprint for my parents. I see Mr. White wiping the sliding glass door, and I swear to God, this coyote is back. Except now, he's standing on his hind legs and clawing at the door to the living room. Mr. White opens fire, and it turns around and takes off into the dark behind the house. I smell that burnt hair smell again. Everybody's swearing and freaking out, and my mum scoops me up. "You need to leave," Mr. White tells me. My dad. "Now, Tim, get in your car and go." Mrs. White is crying and making a phone call by now. So my parents quickly grab our bags and usher me and my sister into our van with my Mr. White, who still has his shotgun. We say goodbye to him and leave. Our car passes another as we head out, and I watched as it stopped at the White's house. I don't know what happened after that. I dozed off eventually. As for the last detail, I don't know if this was a nightmare or just a scared, shitless kid's imagination. But at one point I opened my eyes and saw this effing deformed coyote thing running alongside our van. It glanced at me and took off before I could get a good look at it. But I never saw it again after that. Eventually we got to a town with a hotel and continued along our vacation the next morning as planned. Nothing else happened as we returned home, aside from the usual road trip stuff, of course. Really, the thing that unnerves me to this day about this story is that there are so many details that don't add up or make any sense. It was such an unsettling day, and maybe I remembered things incorrectly or forgot details too. The Whites moved to Colorado soon after, but I don't know if the two are related. I wouldn't be surprised. Raising a kid with a thing like that lurking around your house would be terrifying. Anyway, what's your assessment, folks? Note: I had to report this as the origin was in violation of a rule. Like I said, I'm new here and still getting used to the format. But it's a bit of a blessing in disguise, as now I can update everyone. Commenters on my last post said that I've encountered a skinwalker. I've always been a skeptic on generally everything, but the connections have seriously have me spooked. Stories I've read since last night about skinwalkers are eerily similar to mine. And though I'm not 100% convinced, It's certainly something for me to think about. I can't wait to tell my cousins about this.
Well, my children, I thank you all for listening. I hope these three scary stories terrified you of skinwalkers, and I can taste and sense your fears and sorrows. I'll see you again very soon. So until then, love the darkness as it always follows.